What's going on, everybody? I want to talk about a subject that's been a little bit hot lately, but I want to delve deeper into a subject that has just recently been somewhat newsworthy. For those who've been paying attention, there's a computer hacking activist group called Anonymous that has been taking on the Ku Klux Klan, and they basically brought out a list of 1,000 people who are supposedly and allegedly affiliated with the Klan, if not full-fledged members of it. And of course, within this list, we're talking about various members of government, law enforcement, Department of Education, very noteworthy positions within society, positions that affect us as a society. And in defense of what has been going on with Anonymous, I've been looking at a lot of websites, and I've seen people defend the Klan, which in itself sounds like an oxymoron, but they have been having the audacity to use the Klan in comparison with Black Lives Matter and the Black Panther movement, using juxtapositions with affirmative action and such. But it's the comparison that people have been making with the Klan, comparing them to Black Lives Matter in the Black Panther movement, which astonishes me more than it even angers me, because their reasoning and their logic for making that comparison is that they're basically calling Black Lives Matter a hate group movement and referring to the Black Panther movement as a hate group movement. So in so many people's logic in this country, Black Lives Matter is no better than the Klan. That's their rationale. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read some captions from a book that I am very much into right now, and I'm reading, and I encourage pretty much anybody to read, no matter what their race, to understand better the history of the black person in America. And that is this book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And although it does focus on slavery as a starting point of the psychosis of society in America, it goes deeper than the actual period of slavery. It does cover the period between slavery into contemporary times, and it talks about how we function as a society through an analysis of psychology. It goes beyond just the emotion of it. It attempts to break down psychologically why we are the way we are, and that's black and white. And to compare the Klan to the Black Panther Party is laughable. To compare it to the Black Lives Matter movement is hilariously laughable. And I'm gonna read some captions from this book to kind of better give my reasoning as to why it's laughable. And this is going to be a two-part video. This part of the video, the part one, is going to focus on the past, yesteryear, and my next video will focus on these current times. But let me read you some things about America, some history, things that people probably need to hear a little bit more in graphic detail, because people seem to have this very toned down version of what it was, and very toned down version of what the Klan represents and who they are. So I think a history lesson is needed, something that a lot of people already don't like, but so be it. And it says here, and this is speaking about Jim Crow, which is a period in America, a time period in America after slavery, because people seem to forget that there was a time period after slavery where black people were still being oppressed and physically, mentally, and psychologically terrorized. But let me read it for you. The ability to continue controlling and removing blacks away from white contact was now enacted via a new legislative policy that soon came to be known as Jim Crow laws. Separate but equal living conditions for African Americans, the African brand of apartheid. The conditions for blacks were indeed separate, however, they were rarely equal. What did surface were policies of outright discrimination that banned African Americans from public and private institutions, places of amusement, recreation, even places of worship. Included in this restriction were miscegenation laws, making interracial marriage a criminal offense, sending the strong message that the state believed blacks were so inferior to whites that mixing would threaten the survival of the white race. Now, it's hard to see what their problem was, given that they had been sexually exploiting slave women and children for the past 240 years up to that point. Jim Crow did not stop there, though. What the 14th and 15th Amendments gave, Jim Crow took away. 14th Amendment officially made African Americans citizens of the United States, making it illegal for any state to deprive any individual of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. 15th Amendment ensured that all black males had the right to vote. Jim Crow changed all this. Almost all southern states passed statutes restricting suffrage in the years from 1871 through 1889. Various registration laws, such as poll taxes, were established in Georgia in 1871 and 1877, in Virginia in 1877 and 1884, in Mississippi in 1876, in South Carolina in 1882, and in Florida in 1888. The effects were devastating. Over half the blacks who voted in Georgia and South Carolina in 1880 vanished from polls in 1888. The drop in Florida was 27%. In places like Alabama, for example, where blacks equaled almost half the population, no African Americans were sent to the legislature after 1876 because there was a brief moment in time when black people were actually being voted into Congress. And of course, they couldn't have that. And when black men did vote in southern states, many of their ballots were stolen, tallied in favor of opposing candidates, or simply not counted. Does that sound like a familiar time period to you? Sounds like a time period in which we live in right now. Not unlike what has happened in recent elections in some states today. By the end of the century, most southern states had systematically disenfranchised black males by imposing even more voter restrictions. Remember that term, voter restriction? That sounds familiar too, right? Such as literacy tests and poll taxes. These new rules of the political game were used by white registrars to deny voting privileges to blacks at the registration place rather than the ballot box, a denial previously accomplished by fraud and force. So they just basically found a loophole. With the validation of the separate but equal doctrine by the United States Supreme Court in the matter of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, Jim Crow became the law throughout every state of the old Confederacy. Every aspect of life where blacks and whites might meet and interact was segregated, and with the systematic disenfranchisement complete, it was all but impossible for blacks to seek legal redress for any grievance. Where governmental institutions left off, individuals and mobs continued. So, wherever the government couldn't oppress you, individual mobs oppressed you. As blacks explored their newfound freedoms, they began to set up schools, businesses, and houses of worship. They began to vote, help pass civil rights laws, and elect people to office. Wow, how novel a concept. They began to prosper. This did not sit well with Southern whites. So, to ensure that they maintained their illusion of supremacy, groups like the Ku Klux Klan were established, enrolling members such as politicians, judges, law enforcement officials, and business owners, as well as poor whites as well, trying to make it in this post-war South. These groups happily continued the traditions of their predecessors: rape, arson, murder in the name of state, skin color, and God. If they could no longer legalize blacks into submission, they would terrorize them. The right to vote and the freedom to vote are two very different things. Immediately after blacks got the right to vote, Southerners started fearing their domination. Soon the unwritten law was in place that justified any acts of resistance. The KKK and groups like it vowed to suppress blacks' freedoms and proceeded to beat, exile, and kill them. While lynching seemed to be the method of choice, individuals and mobs were not averse to drowning, shooting, stabbing, or burning. Any method would do. At first, these terrorists' goal was disenfranchisement. Once that was achieved, the terrorism continued. So, just disenfranchising us just wasn't good enough. Black men were killed for any number of reasons. They were killed for fighting with white men. They were killed for disputing terms of contracts with white employers. Sometimes they were killed simply being what was often called uppity, for simply standing up for oneself. Black women were murdered too, because they refused to tell mobs where relatives could be found for the lynching bees. Black males, even boys just into their teens, were lynched simply being accused of looking the wrong way at white women. Sounds kind of familiar too. You look at somebody the wrong way, right? Sounds like something law enforcement people have been accusing people of doing and arresting and terrorizing them for lately. In fact, black men, women, and children were lynched for all kinds of crimes and for no crimes at all. Men and women were put to death at the whim of a mob. Neither judge nor jury was needed. They were now living as free men and women with the same rights guaranteed all citizens of the land. We were being murdered at wholesale rates with the blessings of state and local governments. They even enacted what was called a lynch law in America. I guess it was an unofficial thing. Ida B. Wells Barnett, in her 1900 article, Lynch Law in America, describes the laws of the day. This was words from people who were there, who lived it, who saw it, and who documented it. During the last 10 years, a new statute has been added to the unwritten law. This statute proclaims that for certain crimes or alleged crimes, no Negro shall be allowed to trial, that no white woman shall be compelled to charge an assault under oath or to submit any such charge to the investigation of a court of law. The result is that many men have been put to death whose innocence was afterward established. And today, under this reign of the unwritten law, no colored man, no matter what his reputation, is safe from lynching if a white woman, no matter what her standing or motive, cares to charge him with insult or assault. This contributed to the belief of many in this country that whites living in areas with substantial black populations lived in grave danger on a daily basis, as if they were surrounded by wild animals. Whites in America throughout the world accepted this view of blacks with little question. The boy only got what he deserved was a common refrain of onlookers after a lynching. Now, doesn't that sound familiar too in today's contemporary society? When you see somebody on video get thrashed, violated, even killed by police, they say, oh well, if only he had complied. He only got what he was asking for by not being obedient without being subservient. See how the more things change, the more they stay the same. How many times was such a proclamation uttered with sadness and pity, as if the good Christian people responsible really wished things would have turned out otherwise? How many times did such pious souls deem it right and proper that a human being should be seized by a mob and burnt to death upon the unsworn and uncorroborated charge of his accuser? Doesn't that sound like a familiar theme as well nowadays? Repeatedly, in a nation of laws that presumes every man innocent until he is proven guilty, white criminals blackened their faces and felt they could freely commit any crime so long as they were able to throw suspicion upon a black person. Doesn't that sound familiar too? Wasn't it a thing recently where cops themselves were involved in shooting themselves even, and blaming it on another people? Repeatedly, after their escapades, these same criminals would then lead an angry mob in the pursuit of justice. Once again, from her 1900 article, Ida B. Wells describes lynching in grim detail. This is what really happened. The world looks on and says it well. Not only are 200 men and women put to death annually on the average in this country by mobs, but these lives are taken with the greatest publicity. In many instances, the leading citizens aid and abet by their presence when they do not participate. And the leading journals inflame the public mind to the lynching point with scarehead articles and offers of rewards. Whenever a burning is advertised to take place, like they were advertising this happening. This was like the event of the month. The railroads run excursions. Photographs are taken, and the same jubilee is indulged in that characterized the public hangings of 100 years ago. There is, however, this difference. In the old days, the multitude that stood by was only permitted to jeer or cheer. The 19th century lynching mob, the more up-to-date version, cuts off ears, toes, and fingers, strips off flesh, and distributes portions of the body as souvenirs among the crowd. If the leaders of the mob are so minded, coal oil is poured over the body and the victim is then roasted to death. This was a publicly held event in America for everyone's entertainment. This has been done in Texarkana and in Paris, Texas, Bardwell, Kentucky, Newman, Georgia. In Paris, the officers of the law delivered the prisoner to the mob. The mayor gave the school children a holiday, and the railroads ran excursion trains so that the people might see a human being burnt to death. In Texarkana, the year before, men and boys amused themselves by cutting off strips of flesh and thrusting knives into their helpless victim. Newman, Georgia, of the present year, the mob tried every conceivable torture to compel the victim to cry out and confess before they set fire to the faggots that burnt them. But their trouble was all in vain. He never uttered a cry, and they could not make him confess. While black men made up the majority of those lynched, as mentioned, black women did not escape this form of execution either. In 1918, a pregnant black woman named Mary Turner was hanged, covered with oil, gasoline, and burnt to death. As she dangled from the rope, a man stepped forward with a pocket knife and ripped open her abdomen in a crude cesarean operation. Out tumbled the prematurely born child. 2 feeble cries it gave, and received for answer the heel of a stalwart man, as life was ground out of its tiny form. This was public amusement. This was the legacy of the black person in America during the Jim Crow era. These are real things that happened to us. Real events, real atrocities, real history. Things organized by public mobs, and you have the audacity to compare the Ku Klux Klan to the Black Lives Matter movement. How pathetic are you? How pathetic indeed you are. You are the epitome of pathetic and the epitome of cowardice in itself. You refuse to accept and acknowledge truth. You will, to your last breath, deflect and pass judgment and pass blame and scapegoat others, rather than to accept what was and accept what is, and accept that you can't take the fact that black people are speaking up for themselves because it disrupts your structure. That's all it really comes down to. It has nothing to do with all lives mattering. It has everything to do with you, making it about you and maintaining what you are used to and what you are comfortable with. That's all it comes down to. Maybe your name is on that list from Anonymous. I guess we'll see, right? Stay tuned for part 2. Later.